Brook Thompson. And then just a bit of background about myself. So, like you said, I'm from the Yurok and Karuk tribes of Northern California, based along the Klamath River. My reservation is actually based on the river itself. So our reservation is a mile on either side of the Klamath River from the mouth, 30 miles up. And these are some pictures of me growing up along the reservation on the Klamath. So I have me in like my traditional regalia on the top right, me salmon fishing with my dad. One of the bigger salmon I've caught on the top left, you can see its head is almost as big as mine. And then me with my dad and my grandfather on the bottom left. And this was just a few days after I was born. And even then we have a fishing net in the background. And then there's the other sides of me. So there's the civil engineering side. I have a BS in civil engineering with a minor in political science. I've worked for the City of Portland Bureau of Environmental Services, doing engineering project management for them. And then I do community activism. So I speak to different groups, whether that be federal, local government, or just the public about water issues that Indigenous people are facing. And then the policy side, where I was in Washington, D.C. and interned for Senate Committee on Indian Affairs under Tom Udall of New Mexico. And you might see some other familiar faces of people I got to meet such as one of our senators and some of our state reps, and then Dolores Huerta, who it was a pleasure to meet all these people and kind of hear their perspectives. And then all of these 4 perspectives kind of come together to a nexus of where I think I'm pretty unique when coming at these issues, since there is hardly any Native women in engineering, or I mean, even politics in general. And there is a lot of overlap and intersection between each of these aspects of my life. But unfortunately, usually there's miscommunication between these aspects, or there's just not the right resources to connect these different aspects that really should be working together better. So the structure of the presentation is pretty much going to go over a few different examples of times in the US where we've had water infrastructure that has not benefited tribes to its best ability. And then we're going to talk a bit about California in general, so the Klamath River and the gold rush, and then racism, definition wise, kind of the US government's history with this water infrastructure, and then what we can do about it. And then we'll have about 15 minutes at the end for Q&A, so like 12:45 onwards. And then the first group I want to talk about is the Gila River Pima, who are a successful farming community, and they grew wheat, corn, melons, pumpkins. And I mention this because a lot of reasonings in the past for removal of Indigenous people from waterways is that we weren't utilizing the water or using its uses beneficially for things such as agriculture, but this is a group who did. By 1860, the Gila River Pima maintained 5,000 acres of farmland. But multiple federal laws in the late 1800s encouraged homesteading, which created direct competition with the Pima for land and water use. And some of these acts that contributed was the Desert Land Act of 1877 and the Reclamation Act of 1902, which I'm going to touch on is actually a lot bigger issue in water policy. But by 1890, the water from the river that the Gila River Pima were based on was pretty much gone. And because of that, many of the tribal members had to leave for mining and railroad jobs. And others were forced to cut down their own forests to sell for money. So this led them into extreme poverty, and also to participate in jobs that don't necessarily have the healthiest lifestyles, or left families abandoned because the men had to go work on like mining and railroad jobs, leaving women at home, when traditionally the family unit is very much integrated. And just so you can get a perspective on where these are, the Pima were traditionally on the US-Mexico border. Of course, that's shifted over time, and with that, so has their reservation and area. So there was actually a split between the Pima in Mexico and the US when the border was created. And so a lot of what I'm referring to is the Pima in the US specifically. And now you can see on the right side, their current community area and how it's also based directly on the river. So the Reclamation Act of 1902 affected the Gila River in Arizona, Yakima in Washington, Fort Belknap in Montana, Pyramid Lake in Nevada, Fort Hall in Idaho, and Wind River, Wyoming reservations. So this had a really wide reach when it came to water. I'll read this quote that Indian tribes across the West already facing serious water challenges now faced increased competition as public lands once considered marginal were settled and irrigated, with the remaining water rapidly being appropriated by non-Indian water users. The Indian Service was completely unprepared for what transpired prior to 1900 and did not employ a single professional irrigation engineer and did little to assist tribes in putting their water to use. At the time of the Reclamation Act, this was well known among government officials. Frederick Newell, director of the newly created Reclamation Service, prolifically wrote in 1903 that Indian water rights were in great danger of being permanently lost because the water was being put to beneficial use by others, namely non-Indian farmers, who were encouraged to settle and develop the public domain by the US government. More poignantly, the Indian Service, charged by Congress to assist tribes in making the transition from their traditional ways of life to one more closely aligned with their non-Indian neighbors, did little to help tribes develop the infrastructure needed to irrigate their lands, and did even less to protect their rights to the water. And I don't usually like blocks of text in presentations, but I think this quote's really relevant to what not only went on, for the Gila, but what happened all over the US and kind of created a basis of what's continued to happen with water rights. And again, a lot of tribes lost water rights in areas because we weren't traditional agricultural communities. But this is an example of a community who actually was very based in agriculture and still lost the beneficial uses. And we're supposed to have an opportunity to have equal access as their non-native counterparts, but we're not because of government neglect. And because of that, it's hard to regain those water rights to this day. And that's just perpetuated. So as I said previously, the Pimas of Arizona and Mexico were split into two different groups. And there's been studies on these two groups of people because they're genetically pretty much the exact same group. But since the US created the border, both the groups have fared very differently over time. So the study I usually quote is about type 2 diabetes and obesity. And the Pima reservation in Arizona, their water was affected. And so their food was deprived, all their agriculture died. And when you're also not doing that physical activity farming, there is physical and economic devastation. Not being able to farm their own food led to them having low fat, high carb diets. Their diets were as much as 48% fat. In the 1950s, it was recorded that the diabetes rate among the Pimas of Arizona was 10 times higher than the US average. And in 1965, they had the highest rate of diabetes of any group ever recorded. So for example, such as the affluent area of Rochester, Minnesota, they have 19 times higher rates of diabetes than that group. But on the Mexico side, the only access to this group of Indians was through a rope bridge, and they sustained most of their lifestyle ways that they did previously. And so type 2 diabetes was less than 6.9% of that population versus 38% of the Pimas in Arizona. And then I have a quote here that says, these studies provide compelling evidence of the impact of environment and the protective role of a traditional lifestyle. So this is just an example of how cutting off the water source and these acts of government really affected the lifestyles of this group of people, this group of indigenous people in the US. And when you have these really high rates, it becomes a life or death issue for many people and a quality of life. And then this one, Celilo Falls, is closer to me, where I lived in Portland, Oregon for quite a few years. Celilo Falls is by that area in Oregon. Celilo Falls is a fishing ground on the Columbia River. The picture on the right is before the dams are built of natives fishing on the river. And I've actually met elders who used to fish here when they were kids. It's the oldest continuously inhabited community in North America. But to build the Dalles Dam, it was flooded. The argument was they needed hydropower for World War II, navigation for barges transporting material for World War II, and irrigation for agriculture. And again, here's the argument for agriculture being one of the key reasons, even though in the last example, despite the natives using a lot of the water for agriculture, they were left out of the conversation. And their tribes in the area with the Yakima, Warm Springs, Walla Walla, Umatilla, and Sayus, their treaty specifically granted them the right of taking fish at all usual and accustomed stations, including Celilo Falls. But because the federal government, and also treaties are supposed to be the law of the land, the supreme law of the land, meaning that treaties are a nation-to-nation agreement and technically supersede the US Constitution. But the federal government decided that these World War II efforts were more important and took away the traditional fishing ground, in exchange gave $26.8 million for the losses of the fishing rights. But it's really hard to actually put a price on what it is to lose those fishing rights, not just for you, but the future generations ahead of you. It's definitely not worth $26.8 million. And I want to also bring up the Army Corps of Engineers here, because they're the ones that did this project and also one of the groups who push it. The Army Corps of Engineers will keep coming up here as I talk about the Dakota Access Pipeline, but I have been trying to talk to this Army Corps of Engineers and trying to understand their stance on Indigenous issues better. But their tribal liaison positions that were recently created in the Army Corps, almost none of them have actual Native Americans in those positions. And even though some of the people I've met in those positions have been really nice and great people, there's some filled by, even here in California, the tribal liaison position, white folks that don't have any background in Indigenous studies or with natives, whose whole position is to restore these relationships with the Native community after pushing, projects like this. And that continues to be an issue, not only with the Army Corps of Engineers, but many other government agencies across the US. And then I just wanted to put some resources here in case anyone was interested in learning more about Celilo Falls. So, here's a picture of Celilo on the left. And this picture was taken in people's recent memories and lifetimes. Like when this photo was taken, I know elders who were the age of that little girl there in the photo on the left. I remember seeing fishing happening. And this is what it looks like currently on the right-hand side. And then one of the other big water issues that's been in the news in the last 10 years was the Dakota Access Pipeline, DAPL. which was a 1,172-mile pipeline that crossed the Missouri River. And so I have a picture on the right here. And so it was crossing the top of the Standing Rock Reservation. But it was originally designed to cross at Bismarck, North Dakota, which has a predominantly white town center instead. But it was changed because it said that going through Bismarck would make it 10 miles longer. And they changed for wells that served the municipal water supply. But crossing where it did posed a risk to the reservation's water supply. And the Army Corps of Engineers is the group that made a lot of these key decisions for this process. So there was benefits and losses when it came to changing the route of the the Dakota Access Pipeline. But you can kind of see that the tribe in the area probably wasn't the priority when it came to making that decision. And also a lot of the people there weren't just concerned about it crossing the reservation water in general, but it crossing north of the Missouri River, and if it leaked, endangering everyone's water supply. And so they weren't just concerned about themselves on the reservation, but it was an environmental threat to everyone down of the river as well. In February 2017, the Army Corps granted permits for the project, and 1 month after Trump took office, he issued many, I forget what they're called. Sorry, I'm freezing on this word, but he pretty much fast forwarded a lot of these pipelines that were going on and gave Shrek permission to override some of the issues that they were facing in the previous administration. And it went through, and a lot of people thought the Dakota Access Pipeline was one because we were able to stop a few permits. But after Trump took office, this and several other pipelines were able to be streamlined. And so I was there at the protection site, and there's about 2,000 people when I was there. And so I have me riding a horse with my cousin on the left side. And although I didn't face a lot of violence, I know a lot of people who came back from there who had really traumatic experiences. And it really felt like a disregard for our lives because we had a really strict point to make it a nonviolent protest. Or we like to call it protection instead of protest, because we're not trying to protest anything. We're just trying to protect the waterways. But right, when you shoot people with like water cannons when it's freezing out and you don't have any houses you're staying in, you're just having tents. I don't know what the other side expected to happen, but it just seems like a disregard for life because we're pretty much just standing there and standing in the way, but being hurt. I mean, people lost their vision from being shot in the eye with bullets, from rubber bullets. One woman almost lost her arm, just being sprayed with pepper spray constantly, have all your clothes soaked and dirty for months. And then people stayed in the freezing weather as well, where things just like outhouses, the excrement, the waste froze solid and just piled up. And they had to put heaters in there to try to melt it. And if people didn't feel strongly about wanting to protect this water, they wouldn't have put up with that. But there was this, and then the racism on top of it, where you couldn't even go into grocery stores or gas stations to buy something if you look Native without people yelling at you or trying to follow you or threatening you. And I have never felt so unwelcomed in summer as I have in North Dakota, just for being identifiably Native. And even if I wasn't at the protest or they didn't know if I had any connection with it, people would just be, mad at me or spit at me and those types of actions. When there's a lot of people who gave up their entire lives just to do the thing they believed in, which is protecting water rights. Another big issue that will come up is the Navajo Nation. So the Navajos have a continuous water issue they've been facing since the Cold War, if not before then. So a third of the Navajo Nation does not have tap or flushing toilets. And on top of not having distribution done well in the Navajo Nation, there's all the issues that came from uranium mining from the Cold War, where the government, the US Department of Energy, stockpiled in uranium for the Cold War. And afterwards, they abandoned 521 mines and just left a lot of their equipment there. This contaminated wells and springs, and was from about 1944 to 1986. And they took about 30 million tons of uranium from the reservation. The product of doing this was kidney disease, cancers, and neuropathic syndrome. And just on a personal level, I've met people who had to go through this before they were necessarily knew it was from uranium poisoning, where they took their kids in for tumors and different diseases that were happening to them, weird bloating caused by water contamination. And doctors would tell them, oh, it's just because, all you natives are inbred and, treat your kids horribly and stuff, and wouldn't actually take their concerns seriously and refuse to treat the children. And I recently read a story about a woman who had 10 kids and she only has 3 who are alive still because of contamination with the water. And the 3 still affect health issues because of how they grew up on the reservation with the drinking water. Uranium levels are greater than 5 times that of the safe drinking water standard on many places on the reservation. And then back to the distribution, Navajos are 67 times more likely than other Americans to live without running water. The cost of hauling water is 70 times more expensive than piped water there too. And so you can see on the picture on the right, there's a woman known as the water lady who delivers water by a truck to households and fills up their barrels and buckets for the week. The Navajo Nation has a diabetes crisis as well, like you'll see in many other Native nations. Theirs is caused though by sugary drinks because they're more available, safer, and cheaper than potable water is on the reservation. And then you can come to my river, the Klamath River. So this is a picture by where I used to live on the reservation, right at the mouth, at the lips of the river. So this picture on the right is the Klamath River Basin. And I live right at the mouth. My reservation's kind of just like this, where it starts to bend right here. And there's 6 dams currently on the Klamath River, and 4 of them are currently planned to be removed. This is Iron Gate Dam. It's the largest and lowest on the river, farthest downstream. And one thing you'll notice on this dam is there's no fish ladder. And one of the reasons was because of a policy decision back in the day when these were built around the 50s, where if you had a hatchery just downstream of a dam, you would be justified in cutting off all the salmon habitat north of that. Now we know that there's a lot of issues with hatchery salmon, and that they can outcompete wild salmon. There's genetic issues, and I could go into it forever, but it's just not as an ideal situation of having that natural wild habitat for salmon species. And the general timeline of when this happened: between 1911 and 1962, the Klamath dams were built. In the 1970s, there were the fish wars on the Klamath, where natives weren't allowed to fish on the river at all. And my family actually, still decided to fish and had to have force with, federal government officials trying to take them off the river they grew up on. And it got so bad and other people fished so much that natives had to sneak into the canneries at night and eat the salmon that was scraps on the floors. And I know people in recent memory who had to do that from when they were kids, because they weren't allowed to collect their own salmon anymore, and they didn't have other good food sources. So they literally had to get scraps off the ground like the rats did. And one of the reasons that natives were taken off the river, reasoning wise, was that natives were the ones that were taking over the fish. Population decline even in the 70s. Even though, native populations on the river aren't what changed in the last 100 years when the salmon decline was happening. we eventually got those rights back. And then in 2016, Pacific Corps agreed to remove the dams by 2020. In 2019, they pushed that to 2022. In 2020, there was a FERC ruling that paused the dam removal. And Pacific Corp considered not removing them at all. And just this year, Oregon and California decided to take responsibility for if something happened with the dams. It was a liability issue that Pacific Corp was concerned about. And so now the dams are planned to be removed by 2023, but it keeps getting pushed out, so it gets a bit frustrating for us. And some of the impacts of these dams is the diversions play a major role in Chinook infectious disease rates. It cuts off tons of salmon habitat. The warm, stagnant water is a breeding ground for diseases and parasites. And I'm sure most people listening already know all this stuff, but the increased water temperature, lower DO, relies on the hatchery population, which can also spread diseases, contributes to things like the adult fish kill in 2002, blue-green algae, and then it also impacts our health, culture, and livelihood as tribal people on the Klamath. So here's some pictures from the 2002 fish kill that happened. I was actually a kid on the river. I was 7 years old when this happened, and I was just on the mouth of the river the night before because we had one of our ceremonies that we participate in one of our villages at the mouth of the river. And then in the morning time, we heard people talking about like, oh, this weird thing happening with the salmon and da da da. And I walked out with my mom and dad and saw this site along the shoreline as far as the eye could see up and down the river. And for me, this has been the turning point of where I've based all of who I've become today on this event. Because it was so traumatic to see these salmon that, you know, my relatives, my ancestors for thousands of years have taken care of and managed properly. So I would be able to eat them and enjoy them and live a healthy life, destroyed in an instant. And, you know, the salmon have never really recovered since then. For me, this is my connection to my ancestors, the people who've lived here before me. And, you know, to have everything else that's happened to us as Indigenous people, such as the boarding schools and massacres, being forced on reservation land, lack of resources and access, having this one thing taken away has been like a breaking point for a lot of us. And the trauma from this one event has been passed down on generations who weren't even born yet. So I often see high school kids scared every single year and anxious in the summertime that they're going to see this site or that there'll be a fish kill like this, even though they did not live through it themselves. But they know how much an impact that this had on our community, and that fear and anxiety has been passed to them. And then I'm sure many people here are familiar with this sign as well, about blue-green algae and the caution about it. But for us, seeing this sign along the river is hard because, you know, as a kid, a lot of us grew up playing on the river constantly, and it's a lot of the exercise we get. And most kids want to be in the river and in the water. And my grandfather grew up swimming and getting food and everything from the river. The river is our way of transportation. It's equivalent of our highway. Getting to a place on the Klamath that would take 10 minutes by boat takes hours by a car. And our roads aren't that safe either. And so having something like this doesn't do a lot for us, honestly, because also like we still have to fish and we still have to make a living. We still have to have transportation on the river, but there's not a lot of accessible tap water along the river itself. So when we touch the water, we're not really realistically able to wash ourselves off. And because of that, people do get a lot of skin diseases and issues. And it's also hard for elders and older people who are so used to being on the river with no problem to take this seriously. But this is our main access to water for a lot of our living situations. So even though we'd like to rinse off and shower, and anytime, you know, we touch the water, it's just not a reality for us. And we just have to live with that fact. So fishing is more than a sport for us. This picture on the left here is from a 2005 study on the Karuk tribe, one of my other tribes, who's just upriver of us. And it shows the traditional diet of salmon for us, which is 250 pounds of salmon, or 450 pounds of salmon per person per year. And what that was compared to in 2005, which is 5 pounds per person per year. And that has gone down so much. I'm sure it's closer to 1 or 2 pounds today. And correlating with this is our diabetes rates. So the Karuk tribe has diabetes rates 21% above the US average. Heart disease is 39.6% above the US average. And the first appearance of this came in the 70s. Not having access to our salmon leads to mental, emotional, cultural, and spiritual health issues that we got from eating and harvesting our traditional foods. 72.44% of respondents from a study said they rarely or never had access to native foods. But 44.91% of households said they got at least some of their food from hunting, fishing, or gathering. So we still really do rely on traditional forms of gathering and getting food. It's just that ability has gone down so much, and with that, diabetes and heart rate has gone up. I mean, and for me personally, if I wasn't eating salmon or berries we picked or acorns that we gathered, I would have to eat, commodity food and food that, stays good for a really long time, like pasta, milk, fry bread, which is super unhealthy, but you can make it from commodity food because it's simple. So, just breads, carbs, and whatever fruit or vegetables we got in the can. I didn't get many fresh fruits and vegetables growing up because they're too expensive. And when you don't have very much food, you have to have food that lasts a long time. And so I can completely see how this happens. And I don't know how I could have grown up without having access to fresh salmon and our gathering materials. And then kind of transitioning back out again to California as a whole in the gold rush. If you listened to the Science Symposium and heard Brian Tripp's poem, he mentioned the 1860 Wiyot massacre, which was when many people in a tribe just south of me, who are actually genetically related to the Yurok people, were killed when they were practicing one of their ceremonies on the island. And it was mainly women, children, and elders because the men were out hunting, and they were all unarmed. And like I said, doing one of our most sacred ceremonies, and all killed. And no one was ever held accountable for it because there was militias that were actually legal for quite a while, and they were led by miners, and they were militas to pretty much remove natives, and people would get paid for removing natives in California by killing them. And contact with my tribe only happened in 1851. So, right, the gold rush in 49 is what really brought people to my area and what caused a lot of my tribe and my population to decrease. Miners resulted in the death of 100,000 Indians in the first 2 years of the gold rush. California natives would also often be called diggers by people as a reference to, the offensive word to enslaved Black folks, but also because we were called that because we would dig for roots in the ground. And that's why they would say that, because a lot of our beautiful basketry and crafts was done by root work. So they would see us digging outside. And it was actually legal in California to have Indian slaves. And so Native women, able-bodied men, and sometimes children would be indentured to white citizens and taken from their homes. And this went on for a really long time. Even in the 1900s, in the early 1900s, Native children were being sold in San Francisco. Then there was the hydraulic mining that came along too, that led to higher arsenic, cadmium, copper, cyanide, zinc, and mercury levels in rivers. And actually, artisanal mining is one of the highest reasonings for mercury pollution in the world. The mining and logging also filled the riverbeds with gravel. And so a lot of our other food sources use the smaller riverbeds and streams as their habitat for their young, such as like lamprey, which is really important to us culturally as well. And when those filled in, the lamprey weren't able to lay their eggs and those streams as well. And I mentioned this partially just to give a background on California history, but just the complexity of how we still miss things in government in California. So for example, right, I had to get my California ID, real ID recently. And so I have the ID in the bottom now. But me as an Indigenous woman having to get ID that has a gold miner on it and being constantly reminded of this group of people who devastated my tribe and killed us. And now they're on my ID every single day without discussion on that history is really hard for me. And I think it's honestly just an oversight on California and whoever made those decisions. And it's just one reasoning that we need to have more Indigenous people on all levels of government to catch these things. And just in general, 58 out of 1,000 Native households don't have plumbing compared to 3 in 1,000 white households. Native households are 19 times more likely as white households to lack indoor plumbing, while Black and Latinos are twice as likely. 7.5% of Native American and Alaska Natives' homes do not have safe drinking water or basic sanitation as of 2013. And some current issues that I don't have time to talk about, but if you want to, you can look into is the Line 3 oil pipeline in Minnesota, the Goldendale Green Energy Project in Washington, and in general LNG pipelines in the western half of the US. And so to start wrapping this up, I just want to talk about racism by definition and white supremacy. The Webster's Dictionary definition is the belief that white people constitute a superior race and should therefore dominate society, typically to the exclusion or detriment of other racial and ethnic groups. And so when hearing this quote and thinking back on some of the examples I gave previously, I just like you to ask the questions to yourself: who benefits from these infrastructure projects? Who are the ones who made the decisions for these projects? And how does these historical events affect today's feelings and actions when it comes to current day infrastructure and policy? And then kind of the US's role in a larger standpoint has been through the Federal Indian Trust, and with treaties, and the United States relationship with individual American Indian nations has been through the treaty making process, which is, like I said, nation to nation building, and recognizes the unique set of rights, benefits, and conditions for treaty making tribes who agreed to cede millions of acres of their homelands to the US and accept its protection in return. The Federal Indian Trust responsibility is legally enforceable fiduciary obligation on part of the US to protect tribal treaty rights, land, assets, and resources, as well as the duty to carry out mandates of federal law with respect to American Indian, Alaska Native tribes and villages. And so when hearing that last part of the US's and the government's role in protecting tribes, I want you to think of some of the things I mentioned that's happened in the past where the US had a responsibility to help these tribes integrate and to protect tribes when it came to these different water issues and how they were failed, which leads to current day distrust. Because for each example I gave today, there's thousands of examples that you could find yourself, and then even more than that go unheard and unwritten about. And so when building our current day trust with Native tribes, it's really important to learn that history and why there's this trust. And maybe even the tribal people don't know the specifics of what happened to create that distrust. But much like the salmon kill in 2002, those feelings of anger and frustration and mistrust get placed on their kids and carry down. And so it's going to take a really big effort to try to build those back up because of all the hurt and pain that's been caused by people, that we may not know of or had any interaction with, but as part of the California state government have a responsibility in now. And then, to wrap this up and try to give an idea of how this is also played out in federal government, I want to give some quotes from previous presidents. George Washington said, "Indians and wolves are both beasts of prey, though they differ in shape." Thomas Jefferson said, if ever we are constrained to lift the hatchet against any tribe, we will never lay it down till that tribe is exterminated or driven beyond the Mississippi in war. They will kill some of us, we shall destroy them all. And then Theodore Roosevelt, who was hard for me because as a kid, he was my favorite president, learning about him in school. But then I heard about this quote and it changed my mind, where he said, I don't go so far as to think that the only good Indians are dead Indians, but I believe 9 out of 10 are. And I shouldn't like to inquire too closely in the case of the 10th. And then for me, being in the US Senate, I had to see things like in the Capitol building of Saint Sierra, who was a missionary in California here, and I'm actually on a street named after him, but he was responsible for killing tons of natives who wouldn't convert to Catholicism. And I have to see that every day at work. And then the baptism of Pocahontas and that false story that deals with colonization. And so those are just some examples of like how it's still in our everyday lives in the federal government, and that legacy that those presidents built upon that a lot of us don't acknowledge or haven't been told about, but continues to affect us to this day. So that leads me to my last part. What can we do? So first off, we need more people of color, and specifically women of color, in positions of power, not just roles of power where they have a title, but in positions where they can actually make changes in structures. We need to address systematic racism at a policy level, including implicit biases. So a lot of people don't believe they're racist, but maybe because of, like I said, how things have been passed down, but not necessarily addressed, people make decisions that become racist, even if they're not aware of it themselves. And so the way to get through that is education and then training. Educate, just like I was saying, tell correct histories from Black and Brown perspectives, because for the most part, in what we've gotten in our history classes, it hasn't been from our own perspectives and has been, shifted to be for US supremacy and, shedding a mainly good light on the US and not acknowledging the travesties that happen. But we can't heal from those until we acknowledge them. Next is just having conversations. Don't be afraid to talk about these issues and make a few mistakes, as long as you're willing to learn, right? Because we can't grow as people unless we fumble a bit. And even I make mistakes when it comes to conversations about race and ethnicity and our histories. And when that happens, don't be afraid to call out your peers and be humble about it. Check yourself, reflect, and then do better next time. It's fine. Question who infrastructure is benefiting and who is left out of the conversation. When you're at the table and meetings, look around and see what groups aren't represented there and why they're not represented, and how we can get them at those conversations and at the table. Know whose land you're on and acknowledge it. So if you don't know where you're living currently, who traditionally occupied that land, I would recommend you look it up. And then also, when there's large meetings, to try to have land acknowledgements. And it's not just Natives' responsibility to have these land acknowledgements, because oftentimes I hear that people want to wait till there's a Native representative to say it. Land acknowledgement is really for, honestly, mainly white folks and people and others on the land to acknowledge whose land they are on. Because as Indigenous people, we know whose land we are on and the history there. It's just we need to hear other people acknowledge that as well. To rebuild relationships with lateral leadership. So a lot of times when working with tribes, I've seen it where someone comes in and says they know what's best for the tribe automatically, what they need to fix, without coming at it from maybe that's not what the tribe wants or sees as a priority. And so to really rebuild these relationships, we need to have leadership styles that work one-on-one with tribes, because they really are their own nations, and give them that respect of being their own nations and responsible for and knowing what's best to take care of their own people. So yeah, going on a level playing field when it comes to interacting with leadership. And lastly, to not be afraid to be a leader in California water policy and decisions. I've heard sometimes in different board meetings in different places where people have said they're afraid to make a decision or don't want to because they haven't seen it done before in the past. It's new territory. But as Californians and as I honestly think as leaders in the rest of the US, because of our unique position in the nation, we shouldn't be afraid to take leadership on these issues when it comes to tribal relationships, infrastructure, and policy, and that we should have the confidence to make decisions that are new or scary and just accept that there are going to be some faults when it comes to that, but that will do much better overall because of taking that leadership role. So that's my presentation. Thank you for listening to all of that, and hopefully it wasn't too heavy, but I appreciate it.
Round of applause for Brooke. You can't hear it, but everyone's applauding for you. Thank you so much for that moving and honest presentation that I think for many might be a lot to digest, which is good. It's good that it's heavy. We need to have these conversations, right? One question that came into the chat is, why do you think it's hard for people to face this history and talk about racism against Indigenous peoples?
I mean, there's tons of reasons. I mean, one is that, right, you're told something your entire life. I mean, even me growing up in the US education system, I thought stereotypical things about other tribes. Like I watched Peter Pan growing up. I thought other tribes did the thing with their mouths. And I just thought it was me who was different. So even like how US history has been taught even caught me as an Indigenous person. So I understand that it's like really shaking through a lot of people's worldviews that all this stuff happened. And honestly, some of these things are so horrible that it's really hard for people to even believe that all of these things happen. Like I didn't even know there was, migrant militias or legalized slavery for California natives until college. And, again, probably if I didn't even have to go into all the research for it, if someone just told me about the street, I'd be like probably doubtful of it. So that's one of the reasons. And then probably also feeling kind of responsible for some of the things that happen, or wanting to remove themselves from that responsibility of what happened, or not wanting to acknowledge that there might be benefits that certain people get from, the horrible things that happen to Indigenous people on the land. And so I think that's an uncomfortable feeling, to think that, maybe I'm benefiting from a horrible thing that happened, even though I wasn't directly responsible for it. And I have some kind of responsibility to deal with it now, even though I didn't create the problem. But, it's something we're all going to have to face, and we all face in different ways. I mean, like I'm an able-bodied individual, and there's a lot of people who have different abilities or disabled who face so many issues in the US. And honestly, as someone who is able-bodied, I need to stand up for them and deal with that too, and deal with my own ableism. So whether it's natives or not, we all have different aspects that we benefit from, that we're accountable to others for, to create a better community for everyone.
Great, thanks. Next question. Can you speak to how we might institutionalize Native rights into our California water policy decisions? It's a big question. Any thoughts on that?
I would refer to the tribal liaison. I mean, like I have a few thoughts. I don't know if any of them are appropriate right here. You have to speak to me privately about that if you want my ideas. But I mean, again, just having more Indigenous people, and again, more people of color, more women in leadership positions in all levels of, for example, the water boards and water resources in California would be the start to that, because I'm sure there's a lot of perspectives that I'm not even aware of that would be really beneficial, but I'm just one person, so I don't have the answers.
That's a perfect answer. That's great. Next is a comment, and then a question. Brooke, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, perspectives, and yourself with us today. And this is someone from OEMA, and throughout your internship, I'll add to that. I'm so excited to see where your journey takes you, and continue to be inspired by you, and keep working on how I can contribute to the struggle for environmental justice. So I guess it's just a comment of you're awesome, and thank you so much. Now the questions are rolling in here. Someone else asks, How about integrating Indigenous values about holistic management and humans' place as keystone species? Can we integrate tribal values and become more sustainable in our management practices without co-opting culture? How do we appreciate rather than appropriate? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, we can absolutely do that without appropriation. I mean, again, one of my things I like to push is traditional ecological knowledge. So how we can integrate, well, actually just even like recognizing that Indigenous knowledge is legitimate, because a lot of our knowledge is passed down orally, but a lot of times we are meant to think that only knowledge that comes from institutions that's written down in a very specific way is legitimate. I mean, oftentimes, even when like these Indigenous values are investigated, they are found out to be legitimate. But then a lot of times it's other people, other groups, specifically, predominantly white institutions that have their names on that research. And so tribes don't get that recognition, even though we are using management practices such as like controlled burns, for example. So there's definitely a way to integrate that, and that would through recognizing traditional ecological knowledge, being more outspoken to talking to tribes about that and building those relationships, because a lot of tribes won't want to mention that anymore because they're so used to their knowledge getting stolen or appropriated. So it's working with tribes instead of taking from tribes. And again, to do that, we just need to do a better job at building our relationships, which I think the Tribal Liaison Office is doing a good job at starting. And the fact that the Water Board is hiring more positions and putting effort into that is a good start. What was the other part of that question? Was appropriating versus integrating? I think the other part is also like taking cultural values and not just that knowledge and integrating into our everyday. There's a lot of value systems and management systems that would be beneficial to us. And then when we do adapt those, giving recognition to where those came from, and thanking tribes and working with tribes, because it's going to be a benefit to tribes and everyone else. I think I answered it.
A lot. Speaking of fire management, we've got a related question. We're starting to benefit from the sharing of traditional knowledge by Indigenous people in managing ecosystems, for example, with managed fire. Do you know of any other, or can you speak to any other examples of traditional land or water management that might help us as we adapt to climate change and try to improve land and water management? And maybe I'll add to this question beyond what you've already said, which is partnering closely with tribes to address these issues.
Yeah, actually, so I have a piece of artwork. I was commissioned to make artwork by Arizona State University last year. And so on my website, there'll be a section that says tech, and that piece of artwork is about 4 specific parts of traditional ecological knowledge that would be a benefit to everyone. And I have speakers who are knowledgeable from those different tribes who speak on those parts of tech. And my piece of artwork was beadwork, because a lot of our stories are passed down through things like beadwork and basket weaving. And so it's kind of my statement on how not only like written down scientific research papers are legitimate, but ways of storytelling such as the oral tradition and then the beadwork are valid as well. So I would recommend, thank you, going to my website and checking those stories out, because honestly, there's so many pieces of tech that would be a benefit to us today. I mean, like, right, simple examples would be, it costs a lot to do testing constantly on water quality, but Native people know different bugs, and I think bugs that live in different pH range, or fish that do well in different pH ranges, or that die with certain contaminants. So if we could even do something like self-reporting that deals with Indigenous people writing down the different bugs and identifying those they see in the area, would be a way that we could get a grasp on water quality in different places without spending all that money on equipment and training people to how to use that equipment. But that's just like something off the top of my head. I mean, I didn't really think about it that much.
No, that's great. I wish we could just keep talking like this for hours and hours, but I do want to respect your time and acknowledge that it is 1 o'clock. Again, thank you so much for the way you've weaved, the history that we all must face with your experiences, and then also, providing 8 solid examples of how we can work together to make a better future. So there's lots of kind words in the chat. I encourage you to check them out. And with that, we will close. And thank you again, Brooke.
Thank you so much. And people are free to reach out to me to ask more questions because I love talking about this stuff. So just let me know. And then I know it was a lot to digest, so maybe just take a minute before you go back to work.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon.